Hello and welcome to Blockchain Gaming World episode 124, first one of 2023. I'm very pleased that Yatsu, the chairman of Animoca Brands, is joining me to kick off the new year. How's it going?
Very good. Happy New Year and glad to be here.
Yes, good. So it's been a while since you've been on. A few things have happened in the world since then. I'm sure lots of people know, everyone should know Animoca Brands, well-known game developer, gone through various cycles, now sort of masters of blockchain gaming, very early into the scene, very early into metaverse, some very important projects that you guys are working on. But you see a lot more than probably even me, but most people. How do you make sense of sort of what happened in 2022? Started off pretty well, up to sort of about April. I think we were all sort of swimming along, and then progressively bits started falling off the aeroplane, and I don't know. Have we crashed yet? I don't know. No, clearly not. But
yeah. So I think generally speaking, I think one thing that I may have mentioned before, perhaps even in your podcast, that cycles in crypto just seem to move much faster than any other kind of business cycles that are out there. So this year we should really have gone through 4 or 5 cycles as opposed to, one protracted cycle, right? And I think it was obviously amplified by the fact that we have 2 macros sort of factored as well, which is obviously the economic sort of global sort of aspect with rising rates and so on, and the war in Ukraine and Russia. These are things obviously that have created sort of other effects. And then on top of that, all of the sort of things that happened with Luna and Three Arrows, and the cherry on top was obviously FTX, right? Just to sort of do that. But I take comfort in the fact that despite all of this, we're still here, and as an industry, I mean, right? And people are excited about it. As you may have noticed when you go to these conferences, I noticed this when I went to Korea Blockchain Week, and this was shortly after the whole sort of blow up with Luna and Terra, which obviously Korea was mostly affected by this. And yeah, sure, it sucked and it was tragic, but everyone was happy to build. Everyone was like excited about the market, right? And then even actually I was actually in Token 2049 when the whole FTX thing was blowing up, right? And while people were obviously talking about it, there was still a buzz. It wasn't like people sort of doing funeral marches and so on, right? It was actually people super excited, and we had our London office opening at that moment in time. Yeah. People were sort of, we had like hundreds of people waiting to get in. It was excitement around the space. And so I think that's a comfortable part. And I think there's the other thing which has to be said here is that it's distinction. I think there's really 2 macro distinctions. One is geographic. Asia has taken this completely differently than the West. And I think partially it has to do with FTX. But the fact that Sam obviously is American and has been sort of become the poster and somewhat crypto darling of the West, and suddenly it turned out he was just like this incredible fraud. I think a lot of people are trying to make sense of this mystery almost. It's like, how is this possible that someone like that with this background could turn out to be this complete socio and psychopath, right? Yeah. Like it just didn't seem to compute, right? On the other hand, in Asia, for instance, we stopped talking about SPF a long time ago. And Japan has made metaverse and Web3 basically part of their national agenda. Hong Kong actually went out right after the FTX thing happened. They actually said specifically, this is why we need more regulation, and we need to be we want to be a leader in the space. And before the end of the year, Hong Kong launched its first Bitcoin and Ethereum ETF. I mean, Hong Kong, right? Yeah. When everyone else was saying, oh, China is not going to be okay with this and whatever, there you go, right? So that's one. And then the other one is a distinction between what we describe as Wall Street crypto and culture crypto. Okay. So while culture crypto is humming along, sure, prices are down, but people are excited and building projects, whether this is Bored Apes, Cool Cats, or, other projects that's involved. And then, of course, you have the ones who are trading, the ones who are market making, the ones who are actually in the financial side, in the Wall Street side of business, and they're obviously all depressed, right? And the exchanges. And so there's definitely different conversations happening on those 2 different spectrums. And so if you're in the NFT side, it sucks, but you're ready to build. But you're more pessimistic, I think, for those people who are on the Wall Street side. So those bifurcations are definitely starting to develop much more pronounced.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I guess the other Oh, so 2 points to pick up on. I do think the sort of the narrative was with sort of Sam Bankman-Fried was a lot. A lot of people have been spending 2022 sort of kicking on crypto and sort of enjoying it being down, particularly in North America and
yes,
let's say Western Europe. So that's a narrative that they've quite enjoyed playing up. Who is this mad psychopath who's stolen everyone's money and
yes.
clearly a fire in a dumpster sort of thing. So it's sort of interesting that sort of plays into what they want. And I guess the other interesting was as you sort of alluded to there. China has always been very strong in crypto, but then over the last few years hasn't been because of various decisions being made to get all the mining out and blah blah blah. But it is interesting that we almost have a cycle, two cycles going at different speeds in those different areas. And so China it's interesting. You're based in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong seems to be, from what you say and what I hear from other things, very bullish on it, which seems
Correct.
very odd
Absolutely.
in terms of where most of us in the West think Hong Kong is now positioned as a sort of like, compared to China, very much taking the same rules as China, which clearly isn't the case when it comes to these sort of things. And even in China now, they have their own NFT platform launching. I mean, it's not what we would consider proper, sort of fully decentralized blockchain. It's sort of like a centralized blockchain, but even so, that's sort of NFTs with Chinese socialist characteristics or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think think about historically, what has Hong Kong's role always been?
Yeah.
Hong Kong's role has been the financial intermediary, really, for, I guess you could say, Asia, but really, as of late, predominantly China. Hong Kong is a place where you can do renminbi exchange. Hong Kong is a place where you can have basically free exchange of currency and commodities and assets and trading that you can't do in China, for instance. And so really, China doesn't want to get out of the whole sort of crypto blockchain game. But what they don't want to do is what they haven't done earlier, which is a fully sort of, I guess, a fully open market in financial terms. It doesn't exist in China anyway. So why would they expect that to happen in crypto? And where was the place where that took place? Hong Kong, right? So I think Hong Kong basically is an intermediary. And the other thing, which is unspoken, but I think one can make some assumptions, is that it basically becomes a kind of legal grounds for Chinese capital to enter the world of crypto through Hong Kong, as it has done in the past with regular financial instruments and fiat. So I think this is sort of the area of growth that will come. But then you look at Japan, for instance, everyone's talking about Web3 and NFTs. I mean, even the Japanese government is experimenting with DAOs, right? And actually have an NFT white paper. I mean, I think they must be the first government in the world that has an NFT white paper. And in Korea, while they're obviously somewhat cautious because of what happened with Luna, every gaming company in Korea is talking Web3 and doing something with NFTs and doing something with tokens and so they're all in on the game, right? And those are the biggest gaming companies. I mean, Krafton, for instance, creators of PUBG, right? They're all in on this as well. So I think again the narratives are different. And as you well know, Square Enix, again, I think for the third, if not fourth year in a row, they're like blockchain, Web3, here we go, right? And so it really is different.
I think definitely many things to look out for this year when it comes to blockchain games, but the whole sort of new Oasis blockchain, which is clearly a very Japanese-centric blockchain from some of the sort of pioneers in that field. But it's also interesting that it has Square Enix, as you mentioned, Sega, a whole bunch of other sort of quite very well-known games companies are part of that initiative. We'll kind of see where it goes. We'll see, will it just be a Japanese thing? How widely will it spread? But it's sort of as you say, it is interesting that these other sort of territories, this stuff is sort of baked in now, so there's no sort of debate about whether you do it or whether you don't do it. I mean, everyone's
correct.
Whether they're successful or not, we don't know. But
that's right. But there's absolute commitment to come into the space. I mean, we ourselves as Animoca Brands have opened a Japanese office, and our anchor investors were Kodansha, Shueisha, and MUFG, Mitsubishi Group. I mean, we're talking about the largest Zaibatsu basically entering the space. That doesn't just happen, coincidentally. I mean, it's almost as if that's like Citibank in the US or something, basically investing, in an NFT company, right? I mean, that would be unusual from a Western perspective, but in Asia, it's like, this is where we need to go. You have to also consider that this region in particular has actually, if you think about, I often talk about digital colonialism and the effects, right? Well, actually, one thing you have to also consider is that in a way, the Asian perspective is that it's not just individual colonialism, it's actual national colonialism, because of the fact that, think about the platforms, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or even Amazon, they're the ones who are actually lording over many of these Asian countries in terms of the communities and the users. And so they look at this and say, actually, this is an opportunity where we can maybe drive a narrative, where we can actually lead as opposed to be led. And that's basically one of the other reasons why it's become so important from a national perspective. They're like, we know what happened with Web 2. That didn't work for us. We're not going to sort of miss the window on Web 3. Let's go all in and let's develop that. And in some ways, how, if you think about Korea, how they invested early in broadband and sort of created sort of this cultural powerhouse that really started, if you think about it, from the ashes of the Asia economic crisis. Some wasn't from 1998.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Good. Okay. So, how do we think, as much as we sort of can predict, 2023? As you pointed out, so crypto doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's all this other stuff going on in the world. And I always try and sort of I think I'm quite optimistic about stuff, but always try and remind myself that no matter where things are, things can always get worse. So we mustn't paint a sort of rosy picture. But I think there's some interesting trends, and I guess one of the interesting things I think is that while some of these more sort of hard crypto projects, maybe like L1s or some of this DeFi stuff, it may be harder for that to sort of come out of the narrative of where we are, because that stuff is about sort of trading and money. But games almost sits in a slightly softer position where people like playing games, and game NFTs perhaps shouldn't be, but certainly don't have to be worth thousands of dollars. I mean, you can obviously mint them for like $10, $50. So I wonder how much of an opportunity in 2023 there is for, we've got a ton of games coming down the line. You guys are working on a whole bunch of them, and I wonder if that is something that can sort of re-engage people and sort of start to educate people that NFTs don't have to be these ridiculous, or unridiculous, but they don't have to be these very expensive monkey pictures. They can be a character in a game, So I wonder if that gives us an in, which may not happen this year, may happen 2024. I don't know.
Actually, I think it'll start this year. Obviously, I'm an optimist. In this industry, you kind of have to be, right? But I look at it from the lens of, remember, I mean, we're not talking that long ago, where Bitcoin and Ethereum was literally sort of a fraction's worth what they are today. We're only talking like 4 years ago, right? Where the whole industry looked really bad, right? But if you look at it from just 12 months ago, it might seem disastrous, but in reality, actually, if you take the long-term lens and if you chart it out over a proper sort of period, then actually you think generally things are progressing as they should. And the other thing, of course, is to note that when people are sort of getting out of their particular sort of, let's say, tokens, for instance, many of them are actually keeping them in stablecoins. That's the other thing. It was a flight to fiat, in 2018, 2019. But right now, it's a flight just to another kind of crypto that isn't as volatile. That's all it is, right? Because it's the US dollar. So I think that obviously says something a lot. So the value sits in the ecosystem. It's just not being deployed, right? And then of course VC investing continues to be active. I mean, not as active as it was maybe at the start of the year, or as of the start of last year, shall we say, right? However, it's still happening. And at the end of the day, the funding that happens in this space is still much better than many other areas of technology investing. When you just sort of take that comparative lens. But in terms of the games and the value of these NFTs, I think you're right that particularly Americans, I would say, have more of this concern, and maybe in Western Europe as well. That when they look at basically Bored Apes, they say, "Hey, is that the future of digital ownership?" And if that is, then I'm not interested in this. Understandably so. But that's like saying the entire car industry is made up of Rolls Royces and Lamborghinis, which is of course not true as well, right? And I think the other thing is that there's been so much focus and emphasis on things like play to earn or making money, as opposed to ownership as a principle. And as you know, Animoca Brands has always been sort of pounding the pavement around digital ownership until we can say it no more, right? And we're still saying it, right? But the point on this one is that digital ownership as a right is actually what's attractive. And all the benefits, which could include earning money, but actually have much more deeper value beyond earning money, is now possible because you have ownership. And anytime when you discuss with someone about this and you say, hey, why are you against owning your digital assets, for instance? Most of them will say, well, I'm not against owning my digital assets. Okay, well then what are you against, right? But what they are against is, in their perception, the financification or the capitalism that could take place with it. And I think, again, this is the Western narrative, because people in the West, particularly young people, I think there was a recent study, well, not recent, every year there's a study that seems to indicate that young people are veering more towards socialism in America. And many of them happen to be gamers, of course, because they are also younger. And so they don't like this digital capitalism. But in Asia, actually capitalism is viewed very positively, for that matter. And there was an interesting sort of observation I think a lot of people are making is that this sort of capitalist, sort of entrepreneurial opportunity, the sort of American dream, is actually much more alive and well in Asia than it is in America, right?
Yeah.
And so therefore people in Asia are much more keen around sort of that opportunity because they view capitalism as a positive thing. Whereas in America, not everyone views capitalism in a positive way. And that creates this sort of friction. But you focus on ownership, I think it's okay. And most of those assets might be worth maybe even 10 cents or 50 cents or $1. And that doesn't matter, right? That's okay. But it gives a deeper level of engagement when you start having things that you can own. And if you wish to trade, you can. But remember, trading is only one thing you can do with ownership. Right? You can do so much more with ownership. And you know, as we said earlier, what we're excited about, which again is the narrative that people don't see because it's not been fully in effect. But once you have big enough of these ecosystems out there with millions of users that actually own something, third parties will come and build awesome experiences for that ownership. Right? We see this in the microcosm of things like Bored Apes. Because they're valuable users, right? So you're kind of seeing sort of the Prada Gucci equivalent, right? However, you know, imagine if Fortnite actually was on chain, which likely is never going to happen, given Tim Sweeney's most latest post, right? And then actually, if every other game company could suddenly utilize basically, you know, these assets for these users and make a game out of it, or create a new experience, or create Fashion Night, sort of, you know, Fortnite Fashion Week, or whatever else. This will create an explosion of new services and new opportunities really for indie game developers. I think the biggest riddle to us, not in Asia, but in the West, is actually this is perfect for indie game developers. Like this is what they should want. This gives them freedom. It removes the sort of dependencies that they have from the platforms. But they've been so I guess, indoctrinated with the existing system that they don't see it. And many, as it turns out, many of the people working in the gaming industry are also not, you know, pro-capitalist, shall we say. They view capitalism as something negative. And as a result, their sort of, I guess, their political stance, shall we say, is clouding sort of, I guess, the objective judgment that, but at the end of the day, you can be sort of political about everything, but you will probably still agree that you need to have freedom, that you need to have liberties, and that you need to have ownership, right? I mean, I think those are things that are inalienable to the West. And if you understand that, then you should be okay with NFTs.
Yeah. Without falling off into a different podcast. I mean, I think it's very interesting when you have this sort of thing, you know, particularly, I mean, I guess at the moment, I'm definitely not going to go down there, but free speech is a concept sort of everyone agrees with until you actually go, free speech for who? and then it totally falls apart. So it's one of these things that everyone, of course, free speech. No, but not for you. But anyway, I think it's a good point that you sort of bring out there, that sort of we're in the sort of West, we're in, you know, so developed, we're in this sort of post-capitalist thing where actually people don't understand what capitalism is. They don't understand it's the basic financialization of that society, which is, you know, you could argue that that's not morally neutral in some ways, but basically it's how everything works. But then you pick up a very small sort of aspect of it and then complain that that's it. But anyway, I do think it's interesting whether we will actually lose the term NFT, which I think, again, I mean, play to earn has been a terrible term, but NFT, I mean, more neutral, I guess, as it started out, but not necessarily now a very loaded term for many people. And people have tried to do collectibles and blah, blah, blah. But I think as soon as people can understand in the game sense that, you know, a asset in a game is something you own, and we call that an NFT, or we call it whatever we end up calling it. There's nothing magical about it. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be disposable. You know, these things are basically, they exist at the moment. They just sit in a centralized database, and now we're moving them into a decentralized database that, you know, so it can be accessed in different ways, and that's in some ways a very simple concept, but I think in some ways, you know, I'm always too optimistic, and I'm always too naive that people are going to get these concepts very quickly, and you realise it just takes, almost like it's almost a generational thing that people have to, you know. Well,
I think one of the ways that sometimes helps explain to some people is around network effects. And the fact that when, you know, how do you construct network effects? Well, the way to construct network effects always is to make these, whether it's assets or content or data or whatever, free, right? Right? No. If you own something and it is free to do whatever it wants to, it has the ability to create endless network effects. But if it's permissioned, you don't have the ability to create a network effect, because you always need to ask someone whether it's okay or not, and they may not have the time to even look at it to give you permission to do so, right? And so we see this already happening, and so with digital assets, basically with this, with the NFTs, really it provides the platform where now you can have constant new network effects being built by third parties that you actually may have no idea where it's going to be. Like we envision a future where we might not even, we can't imagine some of the innovations that will begin with these NFTs because of the fact that someone will come up and dream up with something because they have the freedom to do so, right? So it is really fundamentally about freedom. I think NFTs will probably go the way of MP3 eventually. But if you remember, the MP3 player was something, and MP3 as a concept for digital music existed for quite some time. Right, people were talking about MP3s, and I'm listening to an MP3 and all that kind of stuff. And really, it started to fade away when I think Apple started coming out with the iPod and became sort of to move away. Not as a technical standard per se, but just this idea that we now call it an MP3 because suddenly all listening was happening digitally anyway, right? And I think we're at this phase as well, where NFTs are basically going to have the same effect. But just like MP3s ended up becoming a representation of a future rather than necessarily a negative connotation. And I think NFTs are the same thing. When people talk about NFTs, they're indicative of a future of digital ownership of these digital assets that are obviously unique. And it's a moment in time. And maybe 5 years, we're just going to call them things we own online. That's it.
No, there won't be a term, I mean, it's interesting, something you sort of mentioned there, and going back to the sort of play to earn thing being a bit of a sort of disaster. And obviously the problem with play to earn, people were buying stuff to then earn, and that was the economics, obviously, that didn't stack up. I think the interesting trend, and we'll see how widely it goes, I think it probably is going to be a big trend this year for games in particular, is basically this stuff is now free. So it's sort of, obviously Gabe Leiden is doing this whole sort of big Gabe thing with Digidaigaku, which I'm a big fan of. But that's a very specific sort of thing, and he's got this kind of free to own sort of mechanic going on here. But I think in general we're seeing it with other games, Big Time, and a bunch of other ones where certain assets, at least, could be tokens, could be other things. I think Illuvium's doing it as well, where basically you have to play the game and that's how you get some sort of in-game asset, maybe a character, maybe a token or something. And there is no token sale, there is no NFT sale, because people who are playing the game are owning these things out. They may be valuable, they may be not, and I think that just solves a lot of problems around sort of speculative pumping the price. This is what we're minting it at. Has the price gone up or down? If you can wait for free and it doesn't have any value, then you haven't lost anything because presumably you've enjoyed the game.
Yes, and then if you choose to engage with it thereafter because you like what you see, then you participated. And by the way, this is something that actually Phantom Galaxy started doing quite early on, where they gave out basically sort of the initial sort of the initial NFTs, right? The Halberts and the Hopefuls. And that ended up, they're not obviously super valuable, but most of them were, trading at $5 to $10. And, I guess the Hopefuls were trading maybe up to an ETH, that's it, right? So that's obviously expensive, but it's not ridiculous in comparison to some of the other stuff that one sees out there. And the parallel really is around, it's another form of marketing, if you think about it, right? And in the case of Phantom Galaxies, the game was already playable, at least as an alpha. People could try it out and see if they liked it and not, right? And this is actually what you do in free-to-play gaming. You give the game for free, and you spend a whole lot of marketing money to Apple or Facebook or Google to get people in. And then, if they like the game, they stick around. If they don't like the game, the issue is that who did you pay to bring them in? The difference is that in sort of the whole free-to-own or play-to-own parameter, you're actually rewarding the player directly with the advertising budget. Whereas in traditional free-to-play games, you're actually paying Google and Apple and Facebook and all these advertising companies, and how much of that money that you're spending on them goes back into the gaming industry and is generally a big fat zero, or at least a fraction, so small that it doesn't matter, right? So I think that's really the change, and it comes back down to this sort of financification conversation, which is financial systems have always existed in games. They were just never transparent for people to see. And now with on-chain mechanics, you can now actually analyze it and say, oh, this is where it went. That's what it's worth. And oh, this is what you rewarded. And you can make that assumption. You can calculate backwards. And you can say, okay, this was a $3 million marketing campaign because you gave out these assets that were trading for this value. And maybe if they sold it, they could have generated that. But then they would have never gotten the users in the first place. So, it's fair, right? So it's really, once you have transparent frameworks, it allows people to innovate on the model. But if you can never see it, then you never know what to do.
I think that's the irony about a little bit about discussion about sort of capitalism and financialization of things. People that seems terrible and everything. The price of everything and the value of nothing, all those sort of things, which to some degree I agree with. But if you have a transparent financial system, then people understand where the value flow is. They can understand what they want to spend, and people obviously, you know, our behaviours in all forms of life are basically often controlled by, well, I can buy a car and then I won't have to get the bus, and that will save me this time, but it cost me this. You know, all that sort of processing goes on all the time, and there's no reason for it. Having that in games, I think, certainly will create a different sort of game, but it won't make them immoral games. Some games will be worse. No. Some games will be, I think, at the top end, some games will be seeing some games that we could never have, as you sort of said, never conceived that people could build these games. There are going to be lots of maybe different teams involved, lots of sort of guilds, all that sort of stuff, and you're going to have this incredible immersive emerging experience that a single game developer could never build in and of themselves, because there is all this, you know, is a proper ecosystem going on.
And we've seen this already a little bit here, right? Yeah. Because one of the earliest versions, although it's not on chain, is Minecraft.
Yeah.
The value of Minecraft is actually not attached to the game itself. Yes, it is in terms of selling the software license, but it's because of its open source history. You know, someone built a server, or actually thousands of people have running servers, and you have Mineplex, and you have basically sort of mods, and you have a whole ecosystem that actually is what's keeping Minecraft powerful and alive. Without actually, you know, with Microsoft not doing much really, if you think about it. I mean, Minecraft is succeeding sort of, you know, in spite of Microsoft's efforts, which isn't really much, right? And that's because there's now a community that has a quasi sense of ownership, but it's not true ownership per se, right? As we have seen with, you know, some of the anti-NFT policies, right? However, it is a way in which people have a sort of way in which they are involved in the ecosystem, which include financial incentives. Oh, I've run a server. I charge you $5 to use a server. I mean, that's a financial system, right? So, and it wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't open source. So, you know, all these things that are already happening, and I think it's a good example of how open systems actually are better. Minecraft is the second most popular game in the world, after Roblox, by the way, right? You know, and again, most traditional gamers would look at those two games and say, that's not a game. But guess what? Most of the world are playing these two games.
Right. And I think it is interesting. I don't know how well, I guess there is an interesting sort of kernel here that both Minecraft, you know, as you mentioned, you know, Minecraft has basically said you can't have any NFT stuff in there at all, and then equally sort of Steam, which has been effectively running an NFT skins platform for the last 10 years. So basically, we can't have NFTs on Steam without, you know, like Valve's making billions of dollars a year, or billions of dollars of trading volume around CS:GO skins, which are completely, you know, sort of cosmetic skins in CS:GO. And it's sort of, it's interesting
Steam,
that I just think it's interesting that maybe those are so close to being effectively NFTs that they sort of just see cannibalization. They can't. They have too much to lose in that case to open up, even though they should understand that's the direction of travel.
So I think in the case of Minecraft, I do think it is actually a preference / political point that's being made. As we have now seen that at the end of the day, this idea that technology companies are apolitical, I think it's not possible, right? Because I mean, you know, like maybe this was a fantasy we would tell ourselves because we'd say tech is, you know, but the people behind it aren't apolitical, right? You know, they may not even know that they have a political stance, but they just made one, right? You know, and so I think in Minecraft's case, because I guess they have autonomy, they've made a position that was clearly sort of, I guess, to an extent, sort of limited capitalism, anti-capitalist. But I don't think it was as much about protection per se. I think it was more around that they didn't like the system. That's my interpretation. But for Steam, I am absolutely with you on this one. I think that it was a move that they saw was threatening to the ecosystem. You know, veiled in the whole thing of, oh, but NFTs are a scam and therefore we must stop it. And sort of, you know, getting quasi-celebrated for it by, you know, the anti-NFT crowd. But generally speaking, I think this was really a self-preservation move, and we've seen this, right, in industries as well, right? They will just say, you know, they if they see something that's threatening to them, because NFTs are actually going to is an underlying threat for any platform, right? It's actually an underlying threat even for the App Store, for Google Play. I mean, say what you will about Axie, which is actually not doing quite as badly as people would like it to be, frankly speaking, right? You know, the people that are sideloading and playing Axie are actually, really, if you think about it, it's a existential threat for something like Google Play. Because Google Play, suddenly all the services they have and all the benefits is not enough for a game or a blockchain game like Axie to sort of come back crawling and saying, can I please be on the platform and follow your rules? Because people are still choosing to sideload it because whatever experience that Axie is providing is so valuable, which is what ownership does. So I think this is this is the area where I think it is a threat to the centralized platforms, and they're going to have to evolve.
Well, talking of which, I did have to write down. I'm going to ask you about the App Store. Obviously, you've had many years of experience with the App Store.
Yes,
I don't know if you're as confused as everyone else about exactly what Apple has said you can do with NFTs. I mean, do you think that's going to be a significant driver of adoption in 2023, or is that just going to be a whole confusing mess of stuff getting chucked out, Apple changing its rules, people go, I mean, it seems at the moment just as sort of about as clear as mud exactly what you can do. But clearly, if Apple did allow some decent sort of transparent use of NFTs within apps, that you would think that would be, that would drive some usage.
Yeah. So I love the term "clear as mud" because that's exactly what this is, right? Yeah. I think the challenging thing with Apple is that whatever rules they decide today, they will change tomorrow. So in other words, we can't take a look at what they say right now and make any assumptions, because this isn't like government, right? When government enacts a law, then there's parliament and there's a judiciary and there's a process, and at least you have a couple of years before someone else gets elected to make that change, right? I mean, that's the one thing about a democracy, that you have at least that level of transparency, as messy as that may be. But at Apple, it's a snap decision, and so they may very well decide to change that. So I think the only thing that we can rely on with Apple is market forces. So in other words, the way to get Apple to open up and really change its stance is actually not to sort of try to necessarily play within Apple's ecosystem, but is to continue to evolve outside of the ecosystem in a manner where Apple has to stay competitive, right? And so really, I'm looking to Google as an example to say, okay, what's Google's positioning in all this, right? Are they, because they haven't got a position just yet, and talking to some people, I think there's clearly, some pushing and pulling that's going on there. But if Google actually came out with a different policy, that is the force that where Apple's going to sort of maybe react to. But the other thing that's kind of not really been looked at much, but I think we should look at 2023 as a year in which I think the telcos are going to emerge as alternative players. And certainly in Asia, I'm not sure about the US, right? But certainly in Asia, they're emerging because they actually have sort of quasi-app stores that are obviously not as influential, but they can use that as a leveraged platform, because for them, that's not their primary business. So they don't. For them, it's more about sort of getting customer adoption. And when you think about the players in Korea and in Japan, and for that matter, even in China for global markets, there's no skin off their back for allowing NFT games, for instance, on their particular app stores as a form of distribution. So I think it takes us back. If you remember back in 2011, 2012, right? Much of the distribution wars weren't actually about the App Store at all. It was about, Tmall. It was about what, this new platform was emerging. It was about Docomo. Like, it was all these different stores that came out with alternative ways, which actually drove significant traffic back in the day. So I think we're reaching this point similarly as well. So I think 23 going into 24, I think telcos are going to move into the space and say, okay, we have a differentiating factor. We will allow this type of stuff. We're having multiple conversations with them who are all sort of, looking at it very seriously. And you can see, I mean, Samsung has made investments in NFTs, right? SK Group has looked at it. Docomo has announced, NTT has announced a Web3 metaverse fund. I think it's almost $3 billion, right? Okay. So again, you have all these sort of telecom incumbents who are looking at this precisely for that reason, to say, we kind of got screwed here, because we basically ended up becoming essentially subservient to the platform, right? Now, could this be the way in which we can take back some more control? And that's why, so we have enough sides on the other side that actually want to see decentralization succeed, if for no other reason than for self-preservation.
No, it's going back to my history in mobile games as well. Remembering when before Apple and Google, can anyone remember that time? And it was all operator decks, and I mean that was a bit of a messy time. But it was interesting how the duopoly basically destroyed all those guys, and we'll see what happens. And I guess as you mentioned,
they even had alternative app stores for Apple, and then Apple shut it down, right, by saying it's illegal, right? But even that existed.
But it's interesting you mentioned Samsung. So Samsung have sort of done some stuff with their own Galaxy store that has allowed NBA Top Shot back in the day. It was a proper app, and Solana phone. I'm quite interested in see how that one sort of plays out. I mean, obviously it's going to be sort of niche for the Solana ecosystem, but you could imagine there's going to be some usage around that, at least for sort of certain sort of group of people. And there are some other sort of phones coming out with full stack sort of Web3, which is, as you sort of point out, creates pressure. And I think Google's the big one. They actually announced they've got a version of Origins coming out. Right. Quite how cut down that'll be. We'll wait and see. But I think Google is definitely has the obvious differentiation because they're quite keen on blockchain, at least parts of their company, and doing cloud services for blockchain validation nodes and sort of stuff. So,
and the interesting thing about Google is that if you think about the ethos of Google, as at least high level as a corporation, transparency of data actually is perhaps the most important thing for them, right? I mean, search cannot function when it's in a walled garden. And so, where does Google sort of sit in all this? It kind of makes sense for them to promote this, not necessarily for just the revenues that it could derive on their sort of Play Store, but fundamentally as the world's search engine, right? Having things that are openly sort of accessible and transparent is to their benefit, if you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Got a few more things I wanted to discuss while I've got you. So Mochaverse. So Mochaverse is Animoca's own NFT. I don't know what we call it, ecosystem, sort of branding, family things. Interesting. I'm not sure I fully understand it. What's that, I mean, where's that come from? What do you hope to get out of it?
So, I mean, I think Animoca itself has a vision of full decentralization. Yeah. In a way, we are, as a public company, with thousands of shareholders already quasi-decentralized, right? We don't have a single shareholder, for instance, that has has majority votes or casting votes or whatever. So in some sense, we're sort of at least corporately structured in this way. But I think the Mochaverse really was a way in which we can bring the next level of what we describe as the future of stakeholder capitalism. Like, one thing that we really are talking a lot about lately is that we think the future, which Web3 can bring forward, is not shareholder capitalism. We think it's stakeholder capitalism, meaning that customers are no longer just consumers. They become owners in your ecosystem, right? And then we see this, right? If you own land in Sandbox, or if you own an NFT in Phantom Galaxies, or you own a Bored Ape, you're not a shareholder in any of these companies, but you are a member of their community in which you have ownership. Their success or their failure is, you sharing that, right? The good and the bad, right? But you are together sort of connected by a much more deeper bond than just simply consuming, right? And so how do we sort of extend this further out within Animoca itself? And so this is where the Mochaverse was born. But where we are a little different is that we're not actually creating we're not doing classic mint and selling and that kind of stuff. Actually, it's if you have been engaged or own NFT assets within the Animoca ecosystem, or if you're a shareholder of Animoca, or if you're a portfolio of Animoca, you will be able to receive a set of these NFTs, and you will also be able, if you wish to, buy a small amount. And we have over 380 portfolio companies. Yes. We have thousands of shareholders. We have hundreds of thousands of people who own our NFTs. Actually, probably millions if you count sort of Gamey and those guys as well, right? And who own our tokens, which means that even though the initial drop, which is really very small in comparison, it hopefully can ensure full decentralization on day one, because the distribution of this is so distributed. One of the challenges, as you know, is that if you make a paid mint, maybe a whale comes in and takes it over and that kind of stuff. And we really want to sort of decentralize as much as we can from the get-go. And so we seem to have this sort of base in which we can start from that. And so for the other thing, of course, it's sort of signifying a way in which you can be involved in things that Animoca is doing. So I'll give you sort of some concrete examples outside of, talking to people and being part of an event and membership. I mean, that's a given, right? Is, for instance, governance of, our large token reserves. So we have large token reserves that, call it good or bad decision, right? But we haven't solved, right? Yeah. So we're sitting on all these, right? Yeah. But one of the reasons we're sitting on them is because we view them as governance, where we view them as a way in which we can have governance in the future. And you probably know of my involvement with ApeCoin. Yeah. We just went through an election that was that sort of was fairly dramatic at the end, but worked out really well. But this is all part of this sort of process where we haven't, for instance, used any of our tokens in voting because we can't, we shouldn't, right? But what happens if we actually give a portion of these tokens to the holders of Mochaverse NFTs, right, which is already fully decentralized? Then actually they can make a community decision and have an influence, which is different than if we as a company do that, right? Yeah. So it's still, so that's a way in which you can now have an impact to the broader Web3 ecosystem because we're so exposed to it without necessarily creating sort of this corporate overhead structure per se. So that's kind of an example of how we see it happening. And then, of course, access rights to new games and other things and events, is obviously also part of that.
really, I don't want to go too far into this because we're going a bit long now. But DAOs are clearly an interesting thing. But I think one of the things we've learned that basically through last year, a whole bunch of things we thought were quite simple are actually quite hard. DAOs we're not really touching the surface with, and DAOs clearly seem to only you can. There's been some quite high-profile things where some people in DAOs have proposed things which are clearly against sort of what maybe the management want, but they've sort of gone through. So DAOs are almost proving that the community makes really bad decisions, but that's sort of the point of asking the community to do that. So, I mean, with the Animoca, with the Mocaverse, are you just not opening yourself up for a lot of self-serving decisions? That I mean, it's sort of how do you take the stabilizers off the bicycle where, you know. Because you don't want them to make terrible decisions, but you do want them to sort of flex their freedom to make some slightly sub-optimum decisions, maybe.
So I give you some sort of concrete examples here, right? So, for instance, what we've learned, for instance, with ApeCoin is that the special counsel, for instance, is a way in which it basically filters through what's in the best interest, right? And they get elected, so it's like a delegate system, right? Basically, almost like a representative democracy. And of course, they get elected out after certain periods of times, and they basically make decisions that are, so hopefully in the best interest of the DAO. The community can propose, but it still has to go through vetting. It still has to go through KYC and has to go through legal review before it can just happen, right? Yeah. So there is sort of a little bit sort of this sort of parliamentary, if you will, and sort of legislative process, which I think we have a lot to learn from and iterate on. From government systems, there's a reason they're established this way because so this isn't just supposed to be sort of like a free for all situation. I think one of the other challenges, of course, is that in many of the DAOs we see today, there is still dominance amongst a number of whales because of the fact that they have these tokens that they can vote on, and we've been very specific about not using them because of the fact that we represent a corporate entity that obviously has you could argue a sort of an unfair initial advantage. So we didn't use those. But how can we make it effective? Well, by basically giving a portion of these tokens, but maybe not enough to completely sort of control it, but enough to have a voice, right? The whole point is that you want to create enough of a representation, maybe 10% of the tokens that can be voted on, right? For instance, would be a big enough voice as a block, but not big enough to change an outcome if the community rejects it, right? Yeah. So being thoughtful about this matters. And I think what you're seeing right now with DAOs, remember, DAOs are new. And frankly, people's understanding of democracy is pretty new. Yes. And I think one thing that we've definitely seen is that people appreciation of, as you mentioned earlier, on the concept of freedom of speech, concept of capitalism, and for that matter, democracy and property rights, are actually not well understood by many people. So I think when we worked through this approach, as I was just on, we were on the Spaces call, and there were some people in the ApeCoin community that were saying, I've never voted on anything parliamentary or government, but I did vote on this. I mean, to me, that's great because it means that they feel they are empowered. And at the end of the day, if we can practice this democratic muscle in many ways, both good and bad, then actually we will go out to vote because we now realize and respect the fact that actually I may just be one out of millions, but it still matters, right? Which is the thing. There's higher voting turnouts in Asia, for instance, than it is in America. Why is that? Because in America, people have taken their democracies for granted. It was always there. Therefore, shouldn't it just work? And does it really matter? But in Asia, many of them have fought for their democracies, right? They're still living in those sort of areas where they go, actually, this matters, and we have to fight for it. So I think this is a way in which you can remind ourselves, because we don't really practice democracy much at all in life. The company you work for probably isn't democratic. The school that you attended probably isn't democratic.
Hopefully,
maybe even your family isn't run democratically, right? So therefore, how often do you get to practice consensus building? Maybe with your friends, maybe in certain areas, but generally speaking, not that often, I think. So I think DAOs present an interesting opportunity, but we are early. And so this is all part of the experimentation to bring that forward.
Good. On that uplifting note, that was an interesting conversation as ever. It goes in directions I wasn't expecting, which is always good. But I think it just goes to prove, it is sort of, so much to look forward to still. And as I said, yes. I mean, my learning from last year was not to be quite so naive as thinking all this stuff sort of progresses down the line in very simple forms and everyone understands what they're doing and we all sort of move up in some sort of Whiggish history. It comes crashing down and we have to really think about what we're up to. But I think the thing I've learned sort of this year is it does make you reconsider the vision and is your you double check is the vision that you hope this sort of enterprise, at least in terms of games, is that.
Yes.
Do we still think that's sort of valid? And I
think it is.
I think
absolutely.
I'm glad you agree. Be a bit of a shock at the end if you sort of said.
No, I mean, and to me, because nothing has. If you think about it, from before and even before crypto, nothing has changed around our desires to own our stuff.
No.
Right? Fundamentally, it doesn't matter. I mean, if at the end of the day, a gamer may not understand that he's renting, but he still believes he owns it, and he's outraged if he doesn't. Right?
Yeah.
If someone stole your rented assets in the game of a traditional game, a Web 2 game, I guess. He's just as outraged as if someone stole his actual stuff, right?
Yeah.
He's complaining, he's sending message to customer service, a great injustice has been done, you need to solve this for me. He goes on Twitter maybe he goes on Reddit. Like he's doing everything that someone does when actually something real has been stolen from him, right? So we're already there, we just don't understand that actually you never owned it in the first place. And so I think this is the parameter. And now when these things have actual tangible value because they have network effects and because they can be traded and they can be owned, people will fight that much harder. And it's no longer just about is it valuable? It's about the principle, right? People are very principle oriented. They're like, I don't care if this is only worth $50. This is mine. So give it to me, right? I mean, that's what we do in gaming anyway. If someone stole your stuff or sort of, maybe looted you in one of those games where you can do that, they're not going to just sit down, lying down and saying, well, that's okay. I mean, they do all the things that we do in the physical world, including, maybe vigilantism, which, we don't recommend, but, it happens, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, good. Lovely. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Yat. Great talking to you once again.
My pleasure.
And thanks to you for watching or listening, however you're consuming the podcast. Remember, every episode we are talking to people who we're struggling our way through to the goal ahead of us, which is people own the stuff in their games and enjoy them even more than they sort of currently do. So please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you again next time.
Thank you.